Hello and welcome to today's first EGX developer session. I'm Chris Bright from Eurogamer, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce this session on how exactly you work narrative design into big, massive, open sandbox strategy games. I imagine it's kind of complicated, right? You let players do what they want, interact and explore your worlds in their own way. How exactly do you work your story into that? I've got no idea, but thankfully we do have someone here that might be able to give you some idea on this topic. He has the most perfect surname considering his job. It's Mr. Jeff Spock from Amplitude Studios, the narrative designer on Endless Space 2. Please give him a warm round of applause.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Hi, everybody. Welcome to EGX. I'm very excited to be here. I'm very excited to be kicking off the afternoon of developer sessions. I'd like to start with what's actually the teaser trailer for our upcoming game, Endless Space 2.
What if I could begin again? I had reached perfect harmony before they came and destroyed everything. Just need a single drop to change everything.
Okay, that was a trailer for a 4X strategy game. And as you noticed, there was no gameplay, there was no units. It's because a lot of our design philosophy and our narrative philosophy is built around developing the universe and developing the atmosphere that the player plays the game in. So that's a bit what I'll be talking about today. Specifically narrative design in strategy games, more specifically in 4X strategy games, because that's certainly what we do at Amplitude Studios. So it'll be a fairly straightforward session, but first a bit about me. My name is Jeff Spock, as they said, narrative director at Amplitude, one of the founders. I have had the great joy to be working with them for 5 years now. These are some of the games I did before Amplitude. There's a few strategy games in there, Ruse, which is RTS, Heroes of Might and Magic. And I did indeed work on the Alexandra Lederman writing game for a sort of preteen girl audience. But I learned things there too. Now with Amplitude, of course, Endless Space, Dungeon of the Endless, Endless Legend, and the big one that's coming up soon, Endless Space 2. So here's what I'll be talking about today, narrative design in strategy games. It'll be a very straightforward presentation. I will first talk about narrative, and then narrative as it pertains to games, and then how narrative works into strategy games, and then I will stop talking, which may be the high point by the time we get there. So the first question is, and I think it's a question worth asking if you're a game developer, why do we need narrative in our game? Do we need narrative in our game? Because if you don't need it, why is it in there? And is it going to be effective for the player? From my point of view, it's a very valuable design asset. Obviously, the first thing that comes to mind is entertainment. You can make the player laugh, make the player cry, fill in with fear, do what you want. Also, immersion, the idea of whether you're doing a strategy game or an action game, or even if you're doing a serious game. I mean, if you want to do a game about the plight of the world's oceans, you want that to be immersive as well. And one of the ways to do this, a very good way to do this, I think, is narrative. Also, player direction. It's not very cool when you're playing the game to get little arrows saying, okay, turn right here and go up this hill. It's much more interesting if you have a compelling narrative reason to go up that hill. So narration makes the gameplay direction more subtle and more interesting. And finally, of course, rewards, the big cut scene, the big death scene, the big explosion, that sort of thing. That's also a lot of fun to have. And one of the reasons that narrative is such an effective design tool is that, and this is very serious, we are hardwired to understand and consume narrative. There's the obvious cases, film and television, literature, books, short stories you read. But when you think about it, even nonfiction is structured as narrative. If you read a biography of a famous person, if you read an article on the US elections, they'll be structured like stories. They'll open, they'll pull you in, they'll come to some sort of conclusion, and then they'll wrap it up. Narrative is everywhere. A 3-panel comic, if you look at a Calvin and Hobbes, they'll set up a situation, the mom will show up, rising tension, and then something happens at the end that's hilarious because it's Calvin and Hobbes. And it keeps going. Commercials. I mean, think about a commercial. Every commercial is like boy meets product, boy rejects product, boy finds he can't live without product, boy and product live happily ever after. It's in commercials. It's even in, I mean, think about this. Before you could walk and talk, you were getting brainwashed with narrative in your crib with bedtime stories. It's almost in the lizard brain, our ability to understand and match and draw conclusions using narrative. And I think that's what makes it so powerful for game design. So what does it look like? This is a really basic structure. I stole it from Dr. Freytag, who stole it from Dr. Aristotle. You have the beginning, where you set the world up. Then there's the inciting incident, the moment of action, the moment of change. Various, of course, rising action, reversals, that goes on for a while. You have the big climax, and then at the end you tie everything up. And I would like to point out, as a French studio, that is a French word, literally means untying. So, now one of the reasons that I think narrative works really well in games is that if you think about level design or map design in a game, you often get something like a new challenge. You try to face this challenge with what you used on the previous map or the previous level. It doesn't work. A new mechanic shows up. So now you use this new mechanic in increasingly difficult challenges and situations to the point where you get to the boss fight. And then at the end, you get the cut scene, the loot drop, the loading scene, whatever. And these two structures map together in a very serendipitous way. And I think that's one of the reasons that video games have been such a natural fit for narrative, and people sort of have this almost involuntary tendency to map narrative onto the structure. Now, the problem we have is strategy games and narrative are a bit of a different creature from the average action-adventure, and that's for a number of reasons. It's a very big genre. There's real-time and there's turn-based, of course. You can have one victory type, total war, you win the total war, or you can have a 4X game where you might have an economic victory, diplomatic victory, military victory, on and on. You might have maps, a series of levels like a Warcraft or Heroes of Might and Magic, or it might be open world like the Amplitude games. A single-player game or a multiplayer game. Multiplayer doesn't work for a lot of narratives. You can't have 6 Nathan Drakes on the same map chasing the same artifact. It just doesn't work. And then, of course, prefab and procedural. And again, one of the things that makes the Amplitude games very complicated from the point of view as narrative is every game is a newly randomly generated situation. So it's very difficult to set up that sort of very linear, structured, traditional narrative when you don't even know really what the world's going to look like. So these are the kinds of challenges we have. And particularly, 4X, I think, is arguably the least narrative-friendly, if you look at traditional narrative, for doing this kind of thing. Turn-based is okay, because at least you have some sort of gate or rhythm you can perhaps use. But the fact is, you can play the game as a psychotic, murdering conqueror, or you can play it as Gandhi, or you can play it as a robber baron. So it makes it difficult to say, okay, we're going to have a story. How can the story have that many different endings in that many different situations? Also open world and multiplayer. Again, can't have more than one Nathan Drake. So all of this makes my job as the lead narrative guy at Amplitude, let's use the word rich, challenging. So what happens when it doesn't work, because it doesn't always work, is we get quotes like this. The problem with space games, in the words of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, is that space is big, space is empty. This was the problem with the first endless space game, a strategy game with some good ideas, but a distinct lack of personality, which is pretty much the knife to the heart and twisted for the narrative guy who spent all the time building the universe. So we learned. That was our first game. We were a small studio. We were just starting out. So we said, okay, what can we do to make this better? So then the question was, how do we do narrative in the strategy game? What do we use to fix this? And the first reaction, and my first reaction would have been, because I worked a lot on strategy games that had a much more structured standard narrative, was, okay, we'll set some arbitrary locations that the player sort of has to go to, because that's what you do. If you look at an RPG, you can run around in the open world, but then you have to go through a sort of choke point to get to the next open world area. So, well, we could do things like that. We could gate it based on time. In our games, we have scientific eras, and if after you research so many technologies, you open up more technologies. It's like, wait, there's a point. I can use that like a choke point. I can make story. I can enforce story on the player there. Then there's the idea of putting in linear quests, either little events that pop up or longer quests to try to get that narrative in there. And then, unfortunately, but this happens a lot in a lot of games, is in order to make the story work, you have to put in characters that are not necessarily organically in the game, just so that the player hero has a friend or the player hero has an enemy, but it's not part of the mechanics. And that's the biggest problem with this whole approach that first came to me, was that you're trying to force the game design into the narrative structure when they're not a natural match. And that's obviously a recipe for disaster. The marrying of mechanic and story is really important, and when it works, it's incredibly elegant. When you think of a game like Journey, which, the mechanics were really limited, but with those mechanics, the player actions, the actions the player naturally wanted to do in that environment, made this amazing story. And that's sort of the Shangri-La of game narrative, even though there weren't cut scenes and there wasn't a whole lot of text, that made an amazing narrative experience for the player. So we started thinking, okay, what should we do with Amplitude games to fix the narrative, to get this kind of much more interesting narrative in there? Now, you've all probably heard, of course, the idea of emergent story, emergent gameplay. I really would like to say Amplitude Studios thought of it, but we didn't. But the idea is that you simply change how the story is structured and where the narrative comes from. So for instance, we have a lot of complex 4X systems in our games. There's the marketplace system, the ship design and building system, the fleet system, the battle system, the exploration system. All these different systems come together. And you add to them things like, I'm not the artist, so I feel like I can blow our horn here. It's not directly me, but I think we have some of the most amazing artwork in games, and I love the immersion that gives. So you take the 4X system, good artwork. We try to put a lot of lore and history and stories into the universe. One of the most important things I think that I did with Romain, the creative director, was we spent weeks just figuring out what do we want our universe to look like and why. Because we wanted the sense of exploration to not just be, look, I found another star. We want it to be, there's a star, there's a ruin there, there's some history, there's some archaeology, like Indiana Jones kind of thing. You want to go for as much depth as you can while you're playing around in this universe. And then the idea of lots of quests and events, or potentially lots of quests and events. Because if you just take a path, and even if it's procedurally generated, you do pretty much the same path the next time. There's not a lot of replayability, there's not a lot of interest, I think. So the idea is to have things change, little random events, little surprises, things like that pop up. And what you get here is that the story happens in between the things planned by the designers. And I think a really nice analogy is, if you think of the frames, the panels of a graphic novel, you'll see a panel of a wild-eyed madman pushing a button. The next panel will be an atomic explosion. And your brain fills in all the story that happened between those two. And that happens all the time. When there's a fade out and a fade in a movie, or a fade to black, your brain, with this like built-in system it's had since childhood, is filling in all the narrative bits that happened in there, or that might happen, or that did happen but weren't shown. And that actually turns out to be a really powerful way, I think, of developing stories. So what we're trying to do then is really changed the work of the narrative and the design team from structuring traditional linear stories, which we know how to do. I think as an industry, we're pretty good at that. I mean, you look at something like The Last of Us, it's, I don't know what will do better than that kind of thing. So I think we know how to tell stories in games, but 4X games make it a lot more difficult. So we have things like the technologies, the modules, the resources. All those have descriptions. All of those has backgrounds. If you want to dig, there's a little lore with all of these things. Diplomacy. Anytime you contact another faction, there's diplomatic communications. And those communications are in the style and the attitude of the faction that you're talking to. So you feel a little bit more like you're dealing with another species and not just reacting to some cold computer-driven AI that's running in the background every time you hit end turn. Heroes, bios, and quests. These are kind of the characters we put in the game. We have heroes leading your fleets, leading your planets, and you get to evolve them. And they might go off and have their own stories, and they might end up having a hero from another empire who turns into a nemesis. And a lot of that can be done by us, but a lot of that is done by the player. If the player goes exploring, he has a battle here, and he chases some guy away, a few turns later, that same ship shows up. The player has just made this jump in his mind where, oh, it's you again. It's my old enemy. Here we go. It's just a ship that popped in the system and came in. But because we're so good at creating that extra narrative, given the materials, it becomes a very interesting story, I hope, for the player. Then again, cooperative quests and competitive quests, particularly in multiplayer with other human beings. You can do these kinds of things. You can have an ally. Maybe all of a sudden it's really interesting to betray that ally. And if the AI is good enough, even works very well when it's computer generated. And then for every faction, we do our bit of traditional storytelling that goes, like this. But for every faction, to get the flavor of the game, the flavor of that faction, an idea of how the game can be played. We do a sort of a several chapter faction quest that would take maybe about 2/3 of the game to get through. So what we end up with is something that looks like this. Now, you're not going to have all these events and quests pop up if you play one of our games, because you're not playing an RPG. You're playing a 4X, so we want you out there exploring, expanding, exploiting, and exterminating. But in between, we think it's really interesting if there's this richness of events and occurrences coming up, particularly in Endless Space 2, where the most important part of the game is going to be your population, or a very key part of the game. So you have your normal population of cravers, let's say, and they conquer a system. There's some other population there, and that other population has some sort of political intent. Maybe you're a militarist, maybe they're industrialist or pacifist. How do you, well, actually, an example, the Craver, you don't get along with me, eat them, so that was a bad call. If you're the Sophons, for instance, how do you use their skills to improve your empire? Do you try to chase them away? Do you try to augment the number of this particular minor faction in your population so that you can have better industry? And that's just the gameplay mechanics and the pop-up events turning into this player story that becomes, I think, very interesting as things change, and it's different every game, and you replay it every time. And at the end of it, you're going to come out with some sort of, hopefully, very interesting, epic story of how you won this. So, yeah, we didn't invent emergent narrative, but it ends up, I think, kind of mapping into the old familiar structure. We have exploration, and then expansion, and this is when it gets interesting. Once you get really out of your home system, your few systems, then you start running into other people, then you start running into more complex game systems, right? These are the challenges. These are the reversals that you're going to hit. An event will pop. That's a reversal. You have to deal with it. So this narrative is sort of being naturally created by the player's interaction with the game systems. It comes up to a victory condition, which you can take if you want to say, okay, I won, it's over. Or you can keep playing, particularly if you're playing with friends. You might want to keep going. But it gives you at least an idea of, and I think, a familiarity in having this kind of structure to your gameplay session. The thing I would love to see someday is an after-action report where, well, we're not there yet, maybe somebody is, where at the end of the game you hit a button, you get a little film of, Jeff, Emperor of the Universe, from his humble beginnings, this whole, I think that would be great. But what the player hopefully takes away afterwards, and we've seen this on the forums, people will come in who did a 5-person multiplayer game, and they'll write like a short story, half a novel about that game and what happened, and show them maps and the events and everything what happened. And for me, that's really pleasing. It tells me that there is narrative content in there that is interesting because of the stories that the players are telling. So then, when it works a little better, we get, like, my favorite quote of all time: there's a great deal of fiction shoveled like coal into the game's engines, making it burn brighter than it otherwise would. That's like, put that on my gravestone. That's, that was really good. And comments that the weight of the universe is good. Because this is really, once we get away from telling the traditional linear story, that's really all we have. We have our universe, we have our 4X systems, we have our event systems, and we have basically the flavor, I don't like the word fluff, but the fluff text we write and all the resources and the hero biographies and everything like that. And that's all I have as storytelling tools. And it's the way that these things mix together and work together that hopefully ends up creating a compelling narrative experience for the player who's actually going through it. So the takeaway, it's omnipresent. Narrative is everywhere. It really is. And I think if you stop and think about, business marketing pitches are narrative. And it's omnipresent, and it's something you can take advantage of. And if you don't take advantage of it, you should be conscious that you're not, and why, I think. The importance of tying mechanics to story, because when those two are at odds, this famous term, ludonarrative dissonance, where you're maybe somebody on a quest to find themselves, but you're just like killing hundreds of enemies the whole time. And I find that non-immersive. I find the conflict of those two things to pull me out of the narrative, to pull me out of the world. The question of whose story is it from the point of view, not the classic literary point of view narrative, first person, third person, but should the designers be telling the story? Is it that kind of structure? Or do you provide the tools and the player tell their own story? So it's a very big switch in narrative intent and in the approach to putting narrative in the game. And then what I call sort of the content spigot. There's a question, depending on whose story it is, how much content you want to put in there, how much you need. Because, we could add tons more content, but then at some point, people are going to end up spending more time reading than they spend playing the game. And I think there's a balance that you have to find between the different types of interests that a player can have, and how good your writers are in a lot of different things. But that's basically, I realize that was a really rapid run through of narrative, game narrative, and narrative and strategy games. But it's sort of either a 3-hour topic or like a 20, 25-minute topic. And for your sake, I took the 20, 25-minute choice. So at this point, thank you for listening this long. It's actually, I guess I'm nervous. I'm speaking more quickly than I did in the rehearsals. So we have a lot of time for questions about pretty much anything, about writing, about narrative, about game narrative, about Amplitude, about 4X games, strategy games. There's a microphone here. Unfortunately, we'd have to ask you to come to the microphone if you have a question. And we have plenty of time if you are interested, if anybody would like to ask something.
It's quite a basic question, but in designing a universe and a setting that's as sort of rich and detailed as Endless Space, do you have a personal favourite concept that you've introduced?
The question about the universe, which was referred to as rich, which I put in the winning column as well, thank you. Is there a personal concept that I really liked? It has been mentioned before. People have compared our universe's dust to the spice in Dune. It was a partial, there's clearly a relation there. We were inspired by it, but our idea with dust was that it is, we decided, and I think this is maybe a really important decision, we're on world building now, that it was going to be a science fantasy universe, not a science fiction universe. We didn't want it just to be cold, accurate, futuristic physics. We wanted that touch of magic, a little bit of that Star Wars kind of thing in there. So I think bringing in dust as a sort of somewhat magical element that you can use just as if it's a technical thing, but it also has these magical powers. It gave us this sort of breadth to really play around on this barrier between science fiction and fantasy, whereas Endless Legend is much more fantasy. And then the space games get into much more science fiction, but with this little touch of this guy doing that. So I think the way that concept worked out pleased me a lot. Is that?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, yeah. I'm not really much. Yeah, I was just wondering about alien interaction.
Alien interactions.
Yeah. When you define them, like each different race has a different
Right.
story and such.
Right.
How do you keep it surprising each time you actually interact with them? Well, where you're actually defining how these species will interact with you.
Right. That's an interesting question. Yeah. Given all the different alien races we have, how do we keep it interesting if you have several interactions with them? How do we keep the interest when you keep running into them? Is that essentially the...
Yeah. Also, well, each time you actually are interacting with this alien, you are getting better and better to understand how they act, and I'm just wondering how you keep the surprise with any things hidden behind which you don't know.
How do you keep the surprise when you keep running into these aliens and interacting with them? That's a good question, because that's one of the really interesting places where I think the 4X systems take over the narration. We write all the diplomatic texts, we do the faction quests. That alien people, they have a flavor, they have affinities and traits and a certain gameplay. What hopefully will happen as you keep running into them is, because of the whole population issue, the flavor of your empire changes, the flavor of their empire changes. Their goals in the game might start to adjust, or the decisions they use, they might suddenly go less into deciding to try to build wonders to do a wonder victory. They might suddenly decide to start using all their industry to build fleets and go military. And so ideally, we have the 4X system starting to say, here's the twist, here's the surprise. It doesn't come from the traditional narrative guys. It comes from the game structure.
Thank you.
We hope. Thank you.
Hi. Building narrative into a multiplayer game is quite difficult, as you know. I was basically wondering, when you came up with the design, did you kind of design the narrative to be multiplayer and then you wanted to move that into single player, or did you go the other way around, or did you kind of branch off into two? Like, how did you plan that? Right.
How do we design the narrative to deal with multiplayer versus single player? Which came first, which came second? Essentially, we wanted the games to be multiplayer from the start. Even though there's not that high a percentage of players that play it against other people, they're always playing it against other factions, because that's what the game is. So whether there's a human or an AI player there, it's multiple interactions. And so essentially the idea was to give these factions their own character, their own set of reactions, their own set of natural drives and desires. And so when there's a human playing that faction, at the end of the day, whether it's the machine or the human playing the cravers who are really good at conquering planets, consuming them, and moving on to the next one, the narrative isn't at the end of the day going to change that much. Now, of course, there will be people who will take the economic faction and try to do a military victory with it and that sort of thing. And to an extent, that's great if the game systems let you do that, but that's not something that I, as a narrative guy, can really plan for. So the multiplayer aspect of the narrative is, it's awesome, and I have to say it's also very systemic. And so all we can do is give all these very asymmetrical factions a lot of character, so that each person who wants to play the game a certain way will find their faction, will play that faction, and it'll be a natural fit into sort of the pre-planned events and diplomatic interactions that would exist in the game.
Great. Cool, thank you.
Cheers. Well, I hope that answered the question. Yes?
One of the quotes you brought up described fiction being fed into the game like coal into an engine. How many people does it take to do something like that, and how do you choose them?
Well, in that case, okay. This is one of the great things about Amplitude in particular is I officially own the world building. And the Endless Universe was created mostly by myself and the creative director working together. And there was the two of us, before we even founded the studio, throwing ideas around for months. So as far as like person months, there was a lot of them. As far as actual heads involved, there weren't so many. But the big advantage we have is given a really good design team, really good art team, there's always tons of ideas coming in. It's like I'm sure the people who are game devs, they have so many different inspirations. Anything, Game of Thrones to Moby Dick to, from cinema, from literature, from anime, from almost anything. And these ideas keep welling up. And every time we have to come up with a new faction, somebody will come in and say, oh, yeah, there's this thing like that in this anime, and that was great. And if we add this, and we give them, we make them sort of like the mafia. We do that, it's a very organic way to do it. And often what I'll do is I say, okay, we need an economic faction. Here's 3 or 4 ideas of what they could be like. I'll throw that out to the design team, and they'll start saying, "Well, if they're like this, we could have that." So it's very, very cooperative. The short answer was probably be like 6 man months, basically, person months to do that. And the way you choose the people, when it comes to writing, I'm very specific. I choose people who basically have had at least a professional publication. And are really, really good writers and can show they have really, really good, deep cultural knowledge. But you just want to hire people with open minds and a lot of influences, the kind of people who just like bubble ideas up all day.
Thanks very much.
Another too long answer, I'm sorry.
Hi. You were talking a lot about endless space, and I was wondering, like, with Endless Legend and Endless Space having like such different settings, if there was much of a difference between the narratives, like what that difference would be.
Right. Okay. Yeah, the difference in the narrative between doing Endless Space and Endless Legend. There's a huge difference between the first Endless Space that people who played it said it's a fun game, but it feels empty. The universe feels empty. The world is empty. And the advantage we had for Endless Legend, it was on a planet. We had terrain. And so all of a sudden, things like movement and vision are really good because you can get your art department in there and make things colorful and interesting, looking dangerous, looking exciting. And so once we had the terrain, that made I think, a big difference already. That was really at the center of the game. And that was the first time we actually built these faction quests, where you have sort of, I guess there were basically 8-chapter quests that you would go through and learn something about your faction, about the lore of the planet, and that kind of thing. What we discovered was that we were channeling the player too much. It's like, you're the economic factor, you have an economic-only quest line. And they said, well, what if I'm in a game with all these people trying to kill me? I want something military. No, your quest line's like this. And that was like bad Jeff, old-fashioned linear narrative. So what we're doing for Space 2 is we're going to have the faction quests, but you have a lot more options as to how you play it, because we don't know what kind of game you're going to be in. We don't know how that universe generation will work. So I think basically there's a huge difference between terrain and space. And then after that, it's really just learning from one game to another and trying to improve and trying to take lessons and keep iterating like that.
Cool.
Thanks a lot. Any more questions? I'll babble forever if we have time. Let me see if we're okay for... Yeah, I think I'd probably take it.
Hello. One of the things I loved about Endless Legends and Endless Space was the fact that you could customize your own factions, right, develop storylines and choose the traits for them and adapt them to that sort of way of playing. What would you reckon would be your favorite customized faction, if you've ever seen any of the ones? Okay,
a question about the custom factions, because in our games we create what we hope are super interesting factions to play, but of course it makes a lot of sense to mod your own so that it has the abilities, the ones you want. You can play exactly the way you want to play. There have been a lot of really good fan factions come up with. In fact, 2 of the factions, the faction of the cultists in Legend was created by the community. And that, quite frankly, as far as lore and everything, was just so out of left field for us that it was really actually a lot of fun to put together, and to write the faction quest was like a really entertaining narrative challenge. I typically, when I play, I already know the factions that I wrote for so well, I tend to just play the vanilla ones that we ship with the game.
For helping people develop their ability to create factions. So like when they think about creating their own games, they sort of have an idea how to develop a faction. Sorry about that.
So a question about it, when people develop their own games, they have an idea of how to develop the faction?
Yeah, so for people that have tried to create their own games
Right.
and they want to do strategies, Endless Legends was good because it sort of gave them a background of how to develop factions of their own.
That's interesting. I think one of the things that is really important to us is the difference in the factions isn't plus 5% here, minus 5% there. It's really exceedingly asymmetrical gameplay. Like one faction doesn't use food. One faction can't research science. I mean, essentially, the designers come up with a design, and then each faction breaks it somehow, which does not please the programmers much, of course. But it makes the factions very interesting. And I think the fact that you're not just tweaking little numbers, you're actually fundamentally changing the gameplay. It makes it very hard to balance, but I think it makes a very interesting gameplay, very interesting emergent gameplay. And I hope that we'll be seeing a lot more games coming out in the future where you have this kind of radically different faction styles coming in like that. And if the endless games serve as a sort of an initial guide along that path, that's great, because I think we're just scratching the surface on strategy games. Thanks. Is time up? I'm sorry.
Hello? Yeah.
There we are. Great.
Okay,
Cheers.
yeah. There's been like quite a lot of... There's been quite a few like 4 times space games that's coming out in the last year.
Yeah.
Have you played them, and how do you differentiate from them? Or do you not, or would you just carry on doing?
Yeah.
Do you not think about it and just carry on doing your own thing? You know.
No, that's a good question. There's been an awful lot of 4X space games come out. When we released Endless Space, I guess Sword of the Stars 2 had been the year before, and there was maybe a couple other indie ones that year, but it's pretty open. This year we have Master of Orion, Stellaris, Endless Space 2, and a bunch of good indie games. So it's becoming a crowded field. And so the question of what do you think of them? Do you play them? How do you differentiate? That's a very good question. We play them all, basically because we love 4X space games, so that's normal. And I really enjoy the approach on 4X gaming, for instance, that Paradox has. Or that Wargames has with Master of Orion, which is sort of the classic that the original Endless Space was based on. They're fun to play. I think we learn a lot from each other. I'd like to think that some of the things we've done in Space and Legend have been showing up in other games. That's fine. I mean, I think the industry as a whole grows this way. They take ideas from us. We occasionally borrow certain thoughts from them. And you know, at the end of the day, the players get a much better playing experience. It's a challenge for us. We have to work a little harder, but that's normal. I mean, I think if you look at one of these, like, when I think of like crazy games like Europa Universalis or Crusader Kings, where you have this incredible emergent gameplay from these family lines that have been set up just by the game system. I think it's a great example of 4X systems creating really interesting narrative. So yeah, we play them all. We like them all. We think the genre is growing. We hope the demographics are growing. We hope more people are coming in to play games like this.
Yeah, thanks. That's great.
Cheers. All right.
Thanks so much, Jeff. I think we've
just
run out of time. If you guys enjoyed that, please do come back at 4 p.m. We've got Jeff next to someone from Creative Assembly talking about how you make excellent strategy games, which I think is going to be pretty cool. So it's 4 p.m. in this room if you're into that. And yeah, thank you very much. Can we have a big warm round of applause for Jeff Spock? Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.